So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to this week's session of Law and Science. I am Marilyn Haj. I'm an SJD candidate at UVA School of Law. I will serve as your moderator for this session. So before turning to today's esteemed speaker, Kelly Orians, let me briefly introduce the Law and Science Project. Law as Science is an academic initiative coordinated by a group of SJD, JSD, however you call them, candidates from across the United States who share the same belief in legal methodologies. Legal methodologies are often understood as a discipline distinct from sciences, traditionally consisting of doctrinal analysis and normative questions. But through this series of interdisciplinary talks, we aim to show that legal research can be improved and benefit from scientific methodologies that provide systemic ways to approach questions. So if you want to learn more about our project, please visit our website and join our email list. One of our amazing coordinators will drop the links in the chat, so please stay tuned to the chat. Speaking of coordinators, I would like to take a moment to introduce our team. We've got Simon Sun, co-founder of this initiative and assistant professor at National Yangming Chiao Tung University School of Law in Taiwan. Sorry, Simon, if I butchered any of that. We've got Studi Shah, who is a JSD candidate at Columbia. And we've got, last but not least, Sung Chun Chen, who's a JSD candidate at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign School of Law. We've also got Vanessa Villanueva, who's a senior fellow at Law Science, and she is the chief editor of our blog, The Legal Method Lab. Not to mention that we have representatives from diverse law schools in the US, like UC Berkeley, UPenn, University of Washington, Fordham. So if you are interested in joining our team and getting involved, we're always looking for new law and science representatives. We also host a blog on legal methodology, The Legal Method Lab, and we're always on the lookout for new editors. So if you're interested in becoming either a representative or an editor, please reach out to our team. So enough with the shameless marketing. Let's turn to today's speaker. Kelly Orians is an expert on helping formerly incarcerated people re-enter society and prevent recidivism. She directs the Decarceration and Community Reentry Clinic at UVA School of Law. Her scholarship has focused on the collateral consequences of arrests, convictions, and incarceration, as well as the history and impact of sentencing reform and prison reentry reform. In 2015, she was awarded an Echoing Green Fellowship to help launch the First 72 Plus, a holistic reentry services organization serving formerly incarcerated people in New Orleans, and Rising Foundations, a community development corporation dedicated to helping formerly incarcerated people become business owners and homeowners. Who knew that corporations could do good? Today, Rising Foundations is a division of the First 72 Plus, promoting economic empowerment services. Orians served as their co-executive director until June 2021, and she now serves on their board of directors. Orians graduated summa cum laude from the University of Colorado Boulder, where she focused her study on public policy and the rise of mass incarceration. After graduating, she worked at the Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana and New Orleans, managing a statewide advocacy campaign to end the practice of sentencing juveniles to life without the possibility of parole. She helped create public policy and impact litigation strategies, including the implementation of the Graham versus Florida decision, which made juveniles sentencing to life without parole unconstitutional in non-homicide cases. Orians worked on the legal team that secured the release of the first 2 people in the country under Graham, drove them home from the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, and supported them through their re-entry. Through this work, Orians was exposed to the many barriers people and their families face when someone returns home from prison, and began taking innovative approaches to combat the lack of reentry resources in New Orleans. Orians has received the Richard Cornwell Award for Social Entrepreneurship from the Manhattan Institute, a fellowship from the Global Good Fund, and the Michael Rubinger Fellowship for Community Development from the Local Initiatives Support Corporation. In 2019, she was named a leader in law by New Orleans City Business, and in 2020, she was awarded the JMK Innovation Prize from the J.M. Kaplan Fund. Orians is a member of the Louisiana State Bar, where she continues to practice in the areas of post-conviction, parole, and civil rights. So in today's talk, Professor Orians will explore why focusing solely on recidivism rates obscures the real challenges of reentry after incarceration. Drawing from personal experience in reentry program, she will dive into key issues such as unemployment, poverty, homelessness, and addiction that drive reincarceration, and discuss innovative approaches to rethinking public safety and health beyond just preventing rearrest. This talk aligns with Law as Science mission by challenging conventional metrics such as recidivism and advocating for data-driven, multidisciplinary approaches to reentry that reimagine public safety and justice systems. So on the very final note, we will have a Q&A section at the end of the talk, so please stay till the end, prepare some questions. And now, without further ado, Professor Orians, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. I really appreciate that. And I'm hoping to have like at least half of our time, the remaining time, to have a discussion here. So I might try to even go more quickly because I'd really love to hear from y'all. And I know y'all have experience, discussing and studying this topic today. So am I able to share my screen? I have a few, or I just sent a request. Awesome. And I did some slides. Oh, sorry about that.
You should be able.
That might happen again before the call. Okay, I think here I have my PowerPoint. And I'm going to put it up like that. Cool. So let's talk a little bit. So before, as Marilyn noted, before I joined academia, I was working for a reentry nonprofit, as we kind of colloquially refer to this area of work in New Orleans. And I did not have a whole lot of time to read, especially do historical research. And so part of my transition into legal academia was marked by me spending several months just going back through the archives to see where a discussion about reentry really started. Because if you were to do a random survey of folks who work in this space, as well as people who just watch the news, you'd think that reentry was this very contemporary debate and something that came up maybe as recently as the First Step Act in 2016. I'm sorry, the First Step Act passed in 2018, where we saw the first major piece of criminal justice reform legislation pass through both houses and be signed by the Senate since really like the crime bill to a certain extent in 1994. But as I look back, I noticed that this conversation started much earlier. So I put this little chart here today. These are the headlines of various reports going back as early as the 1870s, where the Declaration of Principles adopted and promulgated by the National Prison Association, which is now the Corrections Corporation of America, was putting out their statement of principles. And going from there, we have within those statement of principles, it noted that people returning from confinement back to confinement, which at that point they were referring both to incarceration as well as to facilities that were kind of specifically targeting those who were dealing with serious and acute mental illness, that this was a major crisis. Then we see census data collected on the prison population in 1890, where reentry from incarceration is also noted as a recurring problem, but hadn't been actually tabulated. And the word recidivism certainly hadn't come on the scene yet. Then there's a special report from the US Census Bureau in 1923 called Prisoners' Antecedents. And it was reported that approximately 60% of incarcerated people had been previously incarcerated or otherwise institutionalized. Then in 1939, we see an address at the National Parole Conference at the White House, where President Franklin Delano Roosevelt emphasized the struggle that people coming home from prison have when trying to find employment, and concluded that the circumstances surrounding reentry tend to push a man back into a life of crime unless we make it our business to help him overcome them. He declared reentry to be a national problem, a problem not just for the government, but for every average citizen in every community in the whole of the United States. Despite such strong rhetoric from the commander-in-chief, the first report published on the issue of reentry by the Department of Justice didn't debut until 1984. And in it, then Director of Bureau and Justice Statistics, Steve Schlesinger, echoed the concern of President Roosevelt, now almost 50 years later. The rate at which prisoners return to confinement is a major consideration in the use of limited prison space and an indication of the efficacy of imprisonment as a strategy for crime control. This report really did nothing to spur attention on the topic of reentry. And Director Schlesinger ended up serving through the duration of President Reagan's 2 terms in office, during which time the federal government failed to invest significantly in reentry. And President Reagan's tough on crime policies, as well as the war on drugs, which had originated under Nixon, but then really hit a crescendo under President Reagan, contributed to the doubling of the prison population, which is reflected here, and where we see the rise beginning in the Nixon administration and then go up rather exponentially into 2014. We started to see for the first time ever a drop during the beginning of the Obama administration. But it actually took 16 more years and the addition of more than 1 million people to the national prison population for a US Attorney General to direct attention to reentry. Addressing research that individuals exiting prisons had higher needs than in the past, but were simultaneously facing dwindling access to housing, employment, education, and mental and physical health care. In a speech in 2000, Attorney General Janet Reno proclaimed that reentry from incarceration was one of the most present problems that we face as a nation. So following up on that, under the Clinton administration, the Department of Justice, Labor, Education, Health, and Human Services, as well as the Housing and Urban Development, Department of Housing and Urban Development, inaugurated what was called the Serious and Violent Offender Reentry Initiative, which provided more than $110 million in grants to state and local governments and was evaluated by the National Institute for Justice. With Savori's support, the Serious Violent Offender Reentry Initiative, Savori, 89 adult and juvenile reentry programs were created, at least one in nearly every state in the country. The federally funded evaluation of Savori is still considered the most major reentry study ever conducted. However, it failed to produce any clear evidence for what is effective in reentry, and it failed to establish a clear definition of reentry success. In fact, one of the interesting aspects of this report is that the one thing that was constant amongst all 89 organizations, every organization pointed to, was that people coming home from prison needed money. That was the thing that they could agree on, that they needed access to financial capital. The Savori program dissolved in 2007, but funding for reentry programs has continued in every subsequent presidential administration since Clinton. Much of this, now that exclusively comes through the Second Chance Act. Today, reentry and specifically access to employment and shelter after incarceration have since become a major concern for the private sector as well. And I should say employment, shelter, as well as communication systems. Fair chance hiring and second chance hiring policies, meaning hiring people with criminal records, are gaining broader traction. In 2019, the Society for Human Resources Management, with 800,000 human resource professionals in its membership, launched a campaign to promote the recruitment and hiring of those with criminal records. As the trade group explains, business leaders cannot afford to overlook the 1 in 3 adults the United States currently has a criminal record. And I think that is an important, the way that that statement is structured is important, because it's business leaders who cannot afford to miss to overlook the 1 in 3 adults in the United States. This was not from a charitable perspective, but from a financial perspective and a shareholder perspective. Core Civic, formerly known as the Corrections Corporation of America, the largest owner of private prisons, jails, and detention centers, in 2015 made a $13.5 million investment in residential reentry properties where people nearing release from incarceration serve the remainder of their sentences, known colloquially as halfway houses. In a press release announcing the acquisition, the company noted that the purchase of these properties aligned with needs we're hearing from governments around the country and provides an attractive real estate investment. So again, certainly by no means a charitable notion or anything that has, a double bottom line as far as their shareholders are concerned. This is a real estate investment opportunity that CoreCivic is taking advantage of. Aventive Technologies and its subsidiaries that maybe some of you are more familiar with, Securus and JPay, brought in $770 million in 2020 by charging families as much as $1 a minute for calls from prison, jails, and immigrant detention centers. Securus also routinely piles on sky-high deposit fees. And as a result of the predatory pricing, 1 in 3 families go into debt trying to stay connected to a loved one behind bars and prepare them for release. Notably, 87% of the people carrying that burden are women, disproportionate share women of color. So it seems, as you look at this triangulation here, that mass incarceration has presented incredible business deals as it is becoming of increasing importance to state, local, and federal governments. But taking a step back, just to make sure, I imagine if you tuned into this call, you are well aware of the banner that the United States is the incarceration capital of the world. I will flag that as this conversation gets more ubiquitous, I was, with a colleague, he's not a colleague, he's someone I know who works for the Heritage Foundation. And he told me that this is completely inaccurate because China and Russia are not honest about how many people are incarcerated. And so therefore, we cannot say the United States is the incarceration capital of the world. Still, this is widely adopted and believed to be credible, though it does have a lot of people who critique it. I would say even if the United States is not the leader in mass incarceration, this is still a massive problem. Even if we go to second, I wouldn't define that as a victory. And then where I come from in Louisiana, we briefly were moved from being the incarceration capital of the world as far as a state goes, as far as one jurisdiction goes within the United States, to being second, and Oklahoma became the most incarcerated state in the country per capita. Turns out Louisiana was just counting prisoners incorrectly, and we actually were the most incarcerated state in the country. But I found myself in this moment of I'm not really ready to throw out confetti because we've suddenly gone from first to second. So I'm a huge fan. Actually, almost every chart that I'm about to show you all comes from the Prison Policy Initiative, and I'm a real fan of their research and them as a clearinghouse to produce data. And I also think they produce really lovely infographics, and I encourage y'all to tune in. They have a report on their website that deconstructs this entire chart in really exciting ways that I'm not going to go into today, especially around pretrial detention, which is not really the subject of our conversation today. But as this chart notes, we don't have a singular system of incarceration in the United States, right? It's made up of state prisons, local jails, federal prisons, youth correctional centers, youth detention centers, immigration detention centers, in facilities that provide involuntary commitment, in military detention centers, military prisons, territorial prisons, as well as prisons that are on reservations. Together, these systems hold over 1.9 million people in 1,566 state prisons, 98 federal prisons, 3,116 local jails, 1,323 juvenile correctional facilities, 142 immigrant detention facilities that we know about, 80 Indian country jails, as well as military prisons, civil commitment centers, psychiatric hospitals, and prisons in US territories. And it has a system-wide cost of approximately $182 billion each year. One of the ways that my clinic at UVA is structured is to give students the chance to work in different jurisdictions within that laundry list that I just made that make up the entirety of carceralism in the United States. We work within the Albemarle County Regional Jail here in Albemarle, Charlottesville. We work in federal prisons in Appalachia. West Virginia, which would be largely considered the heart of the coal industry, also has the largest number of federal prisons. There's been some really interesting research about the relationship between the decline in the coal industry and the rise in federal prisons, including also in Kentucky, where one of the largest recent federal prison construction projects has occurred on a mountaintop removal site that was originally used for coal and is now used for federal incarceration. We also work within state prisons in Virginia and Louisiana, and we work within specialty courts that supervise people post-release or act as a diversion program to supervise people. So one thing you might notice as I listed that laundry list of 1.9 million people who are incarcerated, that does not take into consideration the people who are on pretrial supervised release through electronic monitoring, or people who are post-conviction and on probation and parole. So those folks are missing. And that's a crucial piece of this, because if we look here where we have Louisiana, which is known rather infamously to be the incarceration capital of the United States, as I noticed, then you look over on the right side to Rhode Island, which is notorious as a place that does not have a whole lot of custodial incarceration. You see that carceralism is as pervasive between the two per capita, if you take into consideration supervision, community-based supervision, which is increasingly something that we see promoted as a reform strategy that will decrease custodial incarceration and just replace it with community supervision. And that's, I think, a very interesting debate around how carceralism looks if it's not in custodial incarceration. The chart that I showed before was custodial incarceration. This bar graph includes incarceralism, including both custodial incarceration as well as community supervision. And it's really interesting to me to look at the states that have low custodial incarceration, but very higher community-based supervision. So unpacking this a little bit, I think it's important to look at this entire chart, but also think about the people and communities and the intersecting issues that come for the people that make up that entire population. So one thing that I hope is ubiquitous now, and I think especially with the younger generation, to understand that people experience incarceration, that their experience with incarceration and with policing is heavily determined by their zip code, and people's zip code is heavily determined by their race and class. And so we have, despite making up only 1/3 of the United States population, people of color constitute 2/3 of the incarcerated population. And PPI has multiple reports that break down how this looks. 67% of incarcerated individuals living in poverty are living in poverty just before incarceration. And we see the way that this breaks down when it comes to housing stability, income, exclusion from education, and their original contact with the carceral system occurring as a youth. Interestingly, where we see expansions in Medicaid, we also see a reduction in all types of offenses across the board. I actually meant to put this later as we talk about issues to curb that, but this is some sort of optimistic solutions-oriented point. Despite being more proactive job seekers, there's a 27% unemployment rate amongst people living with convictions. And as PPI breaks down for us, when you go back to here, where we look at that 62% of people in prisons are not completing high school. So then the prison system becomes that surrogate for any type of post-secondary or even secondary education. Access to education is incredibly limited. And overwhelmingly, people do not have an opportunity to participate in that. One reason that I see behind this is we have overcrowding within our state prison systems. So increasingly, in Louisiana, for instance, half the population of people who are incarcerated are doing their sentences inside of jails as opposed to inside of prisons. Where prisons are intended to have programs, although limited, jails are more like a temporary stay and don't have programming packed into them. Additionally, the relationship between incarceration and people living with both physical as well as mental disabilities There's we see that people in state prisons disproportionately report having disabilities through self-reporting, and this looks at a different cross-section of how those various things show up, as well as what entitlements people actually have to any type of reasonable accommodation when it comes to accessing program within the prison system. My students and I have several clients who are living with disabilities that we were able to get diagnosed because we were able to bring forensic psychologists in to assess them, referring mostly to to learning disabilities and other developmental disabilities. And when we have one client in particular who he is attempting to make more money, more incentive wages through his job at the prison. But in order to go up to the next income bracket, he has to have a GED, but he can't earn his GED without outside assistance and reasonable accommodations for the test. The prison isn't providing that for him. But then the prison is not creating an opportunity for him to be excluded from that GED requirement so that he can make more money. And we're having to work with it, an honestly very accommodating and nice warden who said this is the first time that he's ever encountered this and hadn't realized how this policy was excluding someone with a developmental disorder from making more money while simultaneously not offering reasonable accommodation to help them get there. For those people leaving prison or living with felony convictions who are able to find jobs, 90% are earning wages that keep them at or below the poverty line. And so when you look at the joblessness rates, as we already noted, the unemployment rate amongst formerly incarcerated people is several orders of magnitude higher for people leaving prison than for the rest of the population. And those who are able to find employment are earning less. This again breaks down along racial lines where you see that the prison penalty or the penalty for living with a conviction is experienced disproportionately by Black women and men than by white women and men. So adding that additional layer of disadvantage that comes not just with a felony conviction, but being someone who carries intersectional identities. One point on this as well is that that formerly incarcerated people are also more active job seekers than the general population. Some of this is due to the fact that employment is a requirement for people who are on community supervision. And if you are not maintaining employment, then that can be used to violate your post-release supervision and send you back to prison. People who have been to prison just once experience homelessness at a rate 7 times higher than the general public. We see both housing instability or homelessness occurring on the pre-incarceration side and then only exacerbated on the post-incarceration side. When it comes for anybody who's lived in New Orleans, I think I saw Emmy on here. I only have like a few people on here. I don't know if Emmy's out there, but this is, and I'm sure people might be able to relate to this in different ways in any city that you're in, but homelessness is not a monolithic experience, right? Like we have people who are sleeping on the streets every night, who are exposed to the elements, and that's the federal definition of homelessness in order to qualify for benefits. But then we also have this whole population of people who are housing unstable. And so they're living with a relative, they're usually a woman, and they're able to stay there temporarily. And that precludes them from being defined homeless for access to federal benefits, but they are still housing unstable. So this housing space is a nebulous field. But I think I tend to use the word housing unstable to capture the entirety of that experience. And PPI does break this down well about unsheltered homeless versus sheltered homeless and marginal housing. I want to zoom in. Oh, and then notably as well, that formerly incarcerated people typically earn below what you would need to earn in order to qualify for public housing. However, the majority of public housing authorities across the United States preclude you from living in public housing on the basis of your felony conviction. Even if a family member of yours is already living in public housing, you can't reunite with them because of your felony conviction. We're seeing some interesting reform work occurring to allow for reunification, but it hasn't gone far enough. Going to the health space, the most common cause of death after release from incarceration is drug overdose, occurring at a rate 12.7 times higher than the general population. And this graph reflects that point. And part of this is related to the fact that only a third of people on probation and parole who have opioid use disorder are able to receive what's called medically assisted treatment. This would be buprenorphine, Suboxone would be the gold standard. What you see more commonly is a drug called Vivitrol, which is an opioid blocker, though it is not considered to be the standard. It is the one that correctional entities across the country are more comfortable with. Additionally, 20% of people leaving prison report being food insecure. And that which is almost twice as high as the general population. And finally, when we talk about all of this, and it goes back to the beginning of the conversation, that the burden of reentry and the burden of supporting an incarcerated person is borne disproportionately by women, but most significantly by women of color. With Black women, 44% of Black women having a family member in prison compared to 12% of white women. And this experience with incarceration spans generations, leading to an intergenerational cycle of incarceration, moving from parent to child to grandparent. In my time working in Louisiana, I've had clients who they are incarcerated, their son or daughter is incarcerated, and their grandfather is incarcerated, and sometimes in the same facility. You have 3 generations in the same family who are serving time all serving life sentences at the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. So now the topic I want to talk about today is around, recidivism. And we know that roughly 83% of people released from state and federal prisons are reincarcerated within a few years. And this is a stat that gets thrown around quite often. When I was a grant writer and when I was working in the public policy space, I would talk a lot about how there are more people currently incarcerated for a second or subsequent term than for the first time, in order to get more support for reentry, to explain that reentry and the failures during reentry are what's driving, in part, mass incarceration. But this is a really tricky territory. And when we throw out recidivism statistics, you should initially have, I'm sure all these people on the call, anytime anybody throws out a statistic, a red light goes out in your head because of how easily manipulated most statistics are. But recidivism in particularly, we throw this out as though this is a term with an agreed upon definition, and it is most certainly not. And so, as we see here, most states track and publish just one measure of post-release supervision, and we break it down into 3 broad categories: rearrest, meaning you just get rearrested, versus reconviction, meaning you got arrested and it resulted in a conviction, versus reincarceration. So you got arrested, you got convicted, but you just got sentenced to probation, then that doesn't count. Versus you got arrested, you got convicted, and you sent to prison, that could count. And very few states actually track what this looks like for people on parole who are in a completely different legal category and have a completely different type of legal exposure. In particular, their reincarceration comes from breaking a status rule, a rule that if you or I broke it, or anybody not on probation, they would not be rearrested, they would not face prosecution. But if you do something while you're on parole, you like drinking alcohol, you could be violated for your parole and sent back to prison. So I'll come back to this. I want to break down. So the ways that we see recidivism show up in wildly different ways depending on the state is broken down here, depending on the jurisdiction. So we have getting arrested versus being convicted of a crime, versus being convicted of a crime that carries a prison sentence, versus being convicted of a crime for the same exact crime that you went to prison for originally, versus just breaking the law, versus parole violations. So depending, if someone throws out a recidivism statistic to you, your first question should be, what is this measuring? And you could see how I should have broken this down as to the most inclusive to the most narrow. I think the most narrow way that I see this used is people will measure essentially, I think they'll call it desistance. So they'll say, well, it's a victory because this person went to prison for armed robbery, They got rearrested, they got reconvicted, but this time it was just for simple robbery. And so they're actually doing a lot better because they didn't go back to prison for as harsh of a crime. And as a former public defender, I find all of this wildly offensive, because any public defender that's doing a good job it knows that we're in a game of negotiation. If we have an incarcerated client, it's essentially hostage negotiation. But for any client, you're just negotiating. And the number of times that I've had a client arrested for, let's say, criminal damage to property. They fired a gun and it damaged property. They didn't hurt anybody, but it damaged property. And then we pled that down to disturbing the peace. Or something even wildly different. They get arrested for armed robbery, and we plead them down to possession of marijuana. They weren't even caught with marijuana. I don't even know. I think actually, if there was more auditing of what's going on, that's actually completely illegal to then have someone plead to a crime that doesn't have any relationship factually to what they were charged with. But that's how the criminal justice system works. That's why, in addition to seeing any recidivism statistic, I would advise all of you to not take for granted any headline you read that says what someone was convicted of, because it may not have anything to do with the facts and circumstances that led to the arrest or the prosecution. It's just the goal of our adversarial criminal legal system is not to produce a true story of what happened. It's just to produce the most believable story, or the story that you were just able to get away with. And that's only if you go to trial. If you plead, which is over 95% of the cases that go through the system, you aren't even going to reduce it down to a story of what happened. You're just going to negotiate until everyone can agree on a penalty as well as a conviction. Additionally, the second question you should be asking is the temporal relationship. Are you measuring rearrest, reconviction, or re-imprisonment within a year, within 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, ever? And then finally, one of the big questions you should ask is selection bias. Where you see this play out quite a bit is you have organizations that will tout their recidivism rate. Well, the problem with that largely is I'm actually not aware of an organization. Well, I'm aware of one study that's happening, and it hasn't concluded yet. It's of the Reentry court program in New Orleans. They're doing a controlled study. Whereas most of these statistics are not born of controlled studies. They're born of you showed up at my door, you wanted help, I tracked you for a year, 3 years, 5 years, and you didn't go back to prison. Therefore, the recidivism rate of my program is 0. I have 0% of people recidivating. What's the problem with that, right? Like, all it is saying that people who showed up and for whatever reason were able to show up, had the motivation to show up, the resources to show up, were already probably one order ahead of maybe the general population because they got to the program. And then we're not measuring it against a general population. Megan Stevenson at UVA has an incredibly great, but also in some ways wildly depressing report that she just concluded called Cause, Effect, and the Structure of the Social World. And the tagline of it is, now we know nothing works. Essentially, she took 50 years of data in the criminal justice reform space and analyzed it and found that the overwhelming majority is not control-based studies. But even those that are producing results that show that the program does not, that the intervention that a program is offering does not have a permanent or even sometimes lasting effect. And that we, on the one hand, are just not measuring these things properly and don't have an agreed upon goal for what success is. But then also that if our goal is recidivism, these programs are not stopping recidivism, even if we could agree on a centralized definition of what that is. So I want to break into, I want to talk with y'all what the 15 minutes that we have left. I threw up some organizations here that are a cross section across the United States. I tried to get them regionally, although I think it's mostly West Coast, South Coast, and East Coast. But these are organizations starting at the top left, the First 72 Plus, where I used to work, A New Way of Life in California is and the first 72 plus provide housing, case management, reentry legal services, peer support groups, social support, becoming an entrepreneur. And if you go all the way around, all of these organizations provide something very similar. The first 72 plus learned a lot from Homeboy Industries. We learned a lot from A New Way of Life, as well as Delancey Street in San Francisco. Some are more tailored. The Fountain Fund provides low interest loans exclusively. Voice of the Experienced focus mostly on civic engagement and full reintegration of formerly incarcerated people on the civic level, and Operation Restoration, as well as A New Way of Life, focus specifically on working with women. And I take, as I've worked in this space for almost 2 decades now, I admire a lot all of these organizations, because for the most part, although you'll find recidivism, I actually went back this morning to see, and I saw the word recidivism just very narrowly on Homeboy Industries page, but it was from a report from many years ago. But otherwise, and we did have the word recidivism for a while. We had that as a measurement of success on our website for the first 72 plus, but none of these organizations measure success based on recidivism. At the same time, what they're measuring success more on this notion of services offered, and they have a lot of testimonials, and so I'm not necessarily holding it out as they are measuring things perfectly, but I think it's notable that they are not letting themselves get caught in this trap of recidivism. And they are a part of a more ongoing conversation about how should we be defining success after reentry. And also, and most interesting in my study, is all of these organizations operate with clients becoming that their client base is not zero sum, it's positive sum, and they're constantly growing their networks and building a community within their network. Many of these organizations know each other, and their clients don't have a limited relationship with them of just a year or 60 or 90 days, that once they become a client, they join this fabric and stay a part of that community. And the ways that operate is very interesting. As they have trip ups and other issues in their life that need to be addressed, they're part of a community that catches them as they try to stay out of the carceral system. Questions?
Wow. Like, thank you so much, Professor Orians. First of all, for making sure that I never trust a statistic ever again.
I think you need that.
Has been broken in my mind, but this is, I mean, especially because I think our audience is primarily, young scholars. We're mostly foreign, so I think really it's been so useful to understand the general picture of what it is to, the incarcerated people, what they go through in America, but also just understanding, because I feel like this is one of these topics where I don't really want to hear from the professor. I want to hear from the lawyers. I want to hear from the clinicians. I want to hear from people on the ground, because they get to witness what these people really go through. And I guess this is going to just lead me to my first question, just to, get the ball rolling. But we often hear, there's this cliche that, especially I think amongst conservatives, that, the people in recidivism, they go back because they want to. Like, these people they love to be in there, and obviously, like, that's wrong. But my question is, like, what do you think is the main culprit in recidivism? And I define that as, you taught us today, as a reincarceration. Well, is it the unfavorable parole conditions? Like, what would you say is like the main culprit?
Oh my goodness. I know. I go back, you'd think I'd have like a really clear answer on this, and I don't. But I do. So one of my clients who's currently reincarcerated now and facing a life without parole sentence, because he's experiencing Louisiana's version of a 3 strikes law. He talked about after the first time you get arrested, it's really easy to get rearrested again. And I think that there's something that we do need to acknowledge about the fact that people's expectations for themselves lower as you continually get disrespected and continually to be treated poorly by a system. You also have lower expectations for yourself. That's not the end of the conversation, because it puts a lot of onus on the person, that it's just them choosing to end up back in these circumstances, which it's not. But the other contributing factors that come into this, it is that the lack of economic opportunities that allow people to fully reintegrate into the mainstream leaves them on the peripheries. It leaves them in the informal economies, not just selling drugs. Survival crimes happen. I think it's a cute way of some advocacy strategy to say, oh, they just stole because they needed bread to feed their families. Like, sure, that yeah, like the Les Mis concept of how this happens is it can happen, but that does not overwhelmingly describe what is happening. But when you're pushed to the margins in that way and you live sort of extrajudicially, that I believe is something we have to pay attention to. By failing to allow people to reintegrate, it continues to push them into having lower expectations for themselves, and then their tolerance for staying out of the system lowers. And ultimately, this also comes down to mental health. And I think I could spend another hour talking about this because I would divide the carceral experience into a lot of buckets. And I think one reason that I see a lot of my clients going back is very unhealthy interpersonal relationships and conflict resolution skills that lead to violence and that lead to reincarceration. And a lot of that comes down to mental health, and a lot of that comes down to a lack of resources to resolve conflicts in other ways besides through violence or besides through calling the police in. James Foreman has a great book that everyone should read called Locking Up Our Own, about the ways in which the Black communities in particular bring police into situations that police should not be involved in and that they are not involved in other communities. That's a very almost offensive oversimplification of his thesis, but I think it's an important one.
Simon.
Yeah. Well, I think so much to discuss, I think, today. And I can gather, I think, 2 points that you're trying to convey. The first is about the incarceration, the societal sort of construct of how it just gets reinforced, and then the issue with the measurement of recidivism. So for the first part, I'm curious about in your experience when people with records, right, and they go back to society, what is sort of so how does the legal system right now, or how do sort of employers treat them with someone with a record, in your experience, that that they would face immediately, that would just really prevent them from getting out of the original system that they were at, and again, maybe race plays a role there. How big of a role maybe it plays in this situation, and also when it comes to reentry, I think the classic sort of discussion about what criminal law system is built for, right? For reentry, for punishment, and all of those. Do you see sort of like a bigger issue here that, within the criminal law scholars, like the imbalancement of this discussion, or it's not being effectively implemented in reality, that reentry is actually an important goal of the criminal law system. It's not just punishment. And I'm also curious about when you talk about the measurement, right? And like the different ways to measure recidivism. Are there any other countries that have like a better measurement that I think in the United States that they can actually sort of borrow, or maybe maybe look into, and may provide a more accurate sort of way to describe really what's happening within the system?
Those are really interesting questions. So starting with the first one, so the employment side of this is interesting because there are other barriers besides the felony conviction that prevent people from fully reintegrating into the workforce. And it's similar with housing, right? Like even if it became illegal, completely illegal to discriminate against someone on the basis of a felony conviction today, there would still be barriers towards people getting gainful employment because of a lack of post-secondary education, as well as skills-based learning. And so even if they don't have the felony conviction, they still wouldn't have the education necessary to get into the employment that they want to, that would be more gainful. And I mean, we talk about gainful in Louisiana as paying more than $15 an hour with a predictable number of hours in a month that you know how much, so you can plan and know how much money you have coming in. And then also in work you enjoy, which is the most controversial factor. And we get called, Marxists and socialists because we think it matters that somebody should actually enjoy what they're doing. And so we think about gainful employment in that way. And those jobs are hard to come by if you don't even have a high school degree or if you only have a GED. And a lot of the ways that our many businesses, not all, but many are structured, they don't have that track that will take you from a low skilled job into higher skilled employment. I was thinking one of my good friends from college, he ended up dropping out and he got a job at Enterprise, and he started and I don't know if Enterprise still does this, but it was a great model where he was able to start at this entry low skill. He was washing the cars, and then there was this management track. I think Waffle House, I heard, might have a similar model. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's a very interesting structure where you actually anticipate that people aren't coming in with the skills necessary, and it's a good business model. Even if you don't care about people from a business owner's perspective, considering the high cost of turnover, it's a good system. So that becomes something as well. There's also self-selection, that people aren't going to pursue jobs because they don't want to be denied. They don't want to be demoralized by that. And so where I actually see it play out more traditionally is not as much people going in, applying and getting rejected, although that absolutely happens. It's more the fact that they wouldn't be qualified anyway. And that's why this is a larger discussion about skills gaps and access to education gaps, as opposed to, and that is what's also contributing to people going into prison and then preventing them from staying out once they come home. On the second question, when we were talking about reentry, and I think this actually relates to the third as well. So we talk about incarceration being criminogenic, and with the point earlier, once you've been arrested, it's really easy to go back, and that's multifaceted why that is, right? But when we heavily police communities, and this is our primary method of social control, but also of public safety, we fragment those communities. And then those communities have a harder time keeping themselves safe because they're completely fragmented. And then once somebody comes home, that social safety net doesn't exist. So I would actually push I push a lot on the reentry front, but I think about it in two ways. We need to put fewer people in prison, extract fewer people from communities. And then we need to support the people that are coming home. But I don't want reentry nonprofits. I don't want the first 72 plus to exist forever. We would like to put ourselves out of business. We don't want to become this necessary part, because that's taking this other side of it, the incarceration side of it, for granted. And we could also spend another hour talking about what is abolition and what does it look like to radically reimagine public health and public safety. I do identify as an abolitionist, mostly because I've seen how ineffective our current strategies are. Not because of just a principled commitment to an idea. Honestly, I haven't read enough of my abolitionist foremothers who have really pioneered this space. I'm actually just hopeless. And I don't believe that the current system is working. And so in order to stop relying on it, I want to give myself permission to radically imagine what it would look like to not depend upon it. Because I do think it's continuing, the policing and incarceration strategies are criminogenic and are just creating this cycle and not actually promoting health and safety. So on the international point, that is so, I actually don't know. Before law school, I traveled from Hong Kong to London by land while I was waiting to figure out if I was even able to get into law school. And I was interviewing prison activists and other people around the countries that I was visiting. And what my main conclusion of that was that there was such a wildly different relationship to incarceration. And for instance, in Slovenia, I went and visited a prison there, and the majority of the people that are incarcerated live in these facilities that have a very different relationship to freedom. People live in the facility, but then they leave and they go to work during the day. It's similar, but not identical by any stretch of the imagination to work release that we have in the US. It's has a totally different culture and feel, but the mechanics of it are a little bit similar. And I think what that does is that prevents the extraction that's happening. And again, I'm painting with very broad brushstrokes. All of these individual jurisdictions internationally, I'm sure, have their own problems. But the idea that we're not fully removing people from their communities, we're treating the needs that they have and then making sure they can more seamlessly go back to living full time. But I think it's a great question about what metrics they're using on that front, because certainly incarceration exists in other countries and people are coming home. I'm just actually not entirely sure how that operates on that end.
So we've got Emmy, if that's okay with you. Do you have a hard cutoff?
Yeah, no, I'm good. Yeah, I'm
okay,
good.
because we've got Emmy and then we've got Stuti. So, and then we'll end, but just to like give them the chance to talk to an expert.
They are bringing in Robert Robertson into the Texas legislature. He's on death row in Texas, and Texas is trying to execute him. And he is supposed to testify beginning at 1 o'clock, but it hasn't started yet that I know of. I would encourage everyone to watch that. It's completely unprecedented and unbelievable. But I don't think it's started yet. So I have until that starts.
Okay. Cut us off whenever you want.
Perfect.
You can go ahead, Emmy.
Thanks. So I know that in New York and Virginia specifically, there's been a lot of like recent legislation passed, like Ban the Box, which bans potential employers from asking about someone's criminal record until they actually offer them the job. And then I know that there's also been the Clean Slate Act, which will automatically expunge people's records after a certain amount of time has passed without rearrests. And then I know in New York, they're also about to enact like a ban the box for housing specifically. So I guess I'm just curious about your thoughts on how effective you think this legislation will be, or if it's kind of more just like a Band-Aid over a bullet hole type of situation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of it. We do expungement clinics. We do expungement work in the clinic. I think you're exactly right. I think it's a Band-Aid solution. I think it's a, what should I say? It's not harm reduction. It's something necessary. But it's also something that we should not be building. I don't think we should build these permanent systems around it and think this is going to solve it. This is just, this is reparative. Reparative? it's repairing, not solving. And so and where it really does cause a problem for a lot of people who are 7-10 years out of incarceration, and they manage to get some sort of post-secondary education. They're trying to get a license. They're trying to do something. And there's just this status. There's just this spot on their record that they can't get around. And so we need to have that removed from their record. And I think it should be automatic. In Virginia, it requires 7 different forms, $92, and you wait sometimes upwards of a year just to get an arrest that did not result in conviction off of your record. And you can imagine how few people pursue that because of how annoying the process is and how laborious the process is and how opaque it is. So it needs to be automatic. It needs to happen at the time of plea. Arrests will go, there will be something in place that will drop it off in a predictable amount of time. And then also for arrests that don't result in conviction, those should not stay on your record at all.
Okay, if you have time for Stuti.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, go ahead, Stuti.
Thank you for that presentation. That was really brilliant. I just have a quick question. I was wondering, just recognizing how prisons actively create disabilities, do you think any positive policies can be introduced while people are incarcerated for them to not experience prisonization once released as intensely? And this is just more to do with the psychological impact of prisons rather than the financial or economic impact.
Totally. No, it's a great question. I was also thinking when you use the term disabilities, I think about the legal disabilities that come out of incarceration. And when I was in Hong Kong, I learned that, at least while I was there, this is like 10 years ago, your criminal record is as protected as HIPAA is in the United States, as your health information is. Like once you're out, you're done, and that record is supposed to not track you, at least for juveniles. I was interviewing juveniles who were transferred to adult prisons. And I thought that was extraordinary and such a different relationship to incarceration and to like paying your debt and being done with it. On that side of it, certainly I'm always going to point to the Scandinavian model. I'm sure we've all heard about the Norwegian prisons where there are cows and strawberries, and it's just lovely and charming and wonderful. And for anybody, did anyone watch that show Atlanta? Has anyone watched Atlanta? Do you remember the episode when Paperboy ends up in prison?
Yes.
Jail in Amsterdam, right? And
yeah.
he's like, no, he gets bailed out and he's like, actually, I'm gonna like finish lunch and take a nap and then I'll be out of here. We're seeing some experimentation with this in San Quentin. They're converting some of their cells to the Scandinavian model. I think that's a little liberal of a use. I was actually featured on Keeping Up with the Kardashians. That was the most insider view that I got, where Kim Kardashian visited and they said, oh yeah, this is our Scandinavian dorm. And I was like, no, this is just an old prison cell that you've now only put one person in instead of two, but you left the metal bunk beds and you left all this gross concrete. It's not the Scandinavian model. But I do believe that incapacitation is a necessary part of a public health strategy. I'm pretty sure. Don't quote me. I'm pretty sure the ability for incapacitation to occur in some circumstances might always be necessary. For any of us on this call who've ever loved somebody with bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, and the relationship to their medication is in flux, which is not everybody, but it's some people. I think you can relate to that feeling of I need to separate this person that I love from myself and from other people, but I don't want them to suffer. I don't want to put them in a cell where they're actually going to get worse. But I know that I need them to separate from me right now. And I think that will always be necessary. So then it becomes a question of how is that decision made to do that such that it's not abused? Because if you give the state the power to kill people, which I believe should never happen, but even to incapacitate them, of course, abuse can happen. And so how do we regulate those decisions? But then where do they go? And how does that isolation and separation not cause bigger problems? And I think architects are the forefront of that. When we talk about an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary movement, I think architects and designers, we need to have abolitionist architects. We do. There are examples of some architects around the country who, do not build prisons anymore. And they refuse, and there's a coalition of architects that refuse to be involved in the construction of carceral facilities. But then we need to be more productive and asset-based of, okay, well, what are we going to build next? And how are we going to have architects that work with psychologists or psychiatrists, that work with health professionals, that work with lawyers who can, balance that liberty interest to design spaces that are healthy for people, and not just when we need to incapacitate them, but also before. We should not be building schools that look like prisons and are just conditioning kids to accept carceralism. And that is not hyperbolic, right? Like the architects that build schools in California also build the prisons. And anybody who's been in an elementary school, middle school, or high school recently, and also has been in a prison, you will see the structure is nearly identical. And the rules are very, very reflective of carceral policies, the way you march down hallways, the way your walls exist, the way we get conditioned from a very young age to accept that type of state control. So I think our architects looking front-ended at how our communities are structured, but then also how do we manage incapacitation? I would need to look for them for an answer on that. But I don't think it's bars. It's not bars. I'm not going to say I don't think it's not bars. It's not built-in metal furniture that is offensive to look at and also really bad on your body. And it's not in a space where you can't, where you don't have any version of privacy, and your most basic human functions are constantly on display, that compromises your dignity. So I know what it's not. I just am not entirely sure what it is.
So as depressing as some of the factors in today's talk were, this is hands down one of my favorite talks. So on behalf of Law Science, I want to thank you. Would it be okay if we took a group picture, like just a snap?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Simon, can you do that for us, please?
Yes, yes. Thank you.
So
All right,
much.
turn on your camera. 1, 2, 3. All right, let's take another one. Wait a second.
That's
1,
cute.
2, 3. Great.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Orians, for your time. Thank you, everyone.
No, thanks for including me.
Of course, and tell Thomas that you did a better job than him. Just in theory, I'm sure you're more scientific than him. And
Really all I'm going for. Yeah, that's once. Yeah, no, once I got married, I just really try to be better than my husband every day. So.
Oh my God. And for everyone else, we have one last talk for Law Science this semester. So make sure to, stay tuned in with our email list. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.